Over to Vicki, and she'll make a couple of introductory remarks, and then we'll launch into just a brief set of reflections here, and then open the floor to you guys and have an exchange. Vicki, why don't you get us started off here?
Good. Well, welcome everyone to this discussion of Richard Biernacki's book, Reinventing Evidence in Social Inquiry, Encoding Facts and Variables. And thanks also to the organizers, Catherine, Eric, and Daniel, for putting this event together. It is designed, as you understand, to facilitate discussion. So we've asked you to please read at least part, if not all, of the book before coming here today. Our three panelists are Dylan Riley, Mara Loveman, and Haveman, and they will share their thoughts. Each of them will speak for about 10 minutes. So I want to introduce this with a brief word about Rick Biernacki. As many of you know, once upon a time he was a graduate student in this department. He completed his dissertation in December 1988. After teaching for a year at Chicago, where he had been an undergraduate, he then moved to UC San Diego, to the sociology department, where he has been ever since. His dissertation won the ASA Dissertation Award and was subsequently published as a book with the title Fabrication of Labor, Germany and Britain, 1640 to 1914. The book has been widely acclaimed, and over the years Rick has written on a number of subjects, moving from labor to matters of time and space, cultural and historical sociology, and the epistemological underpinnings of the discipline. Reinventing Evidence was a controversial book even before its publication. An overview of the circumstances surrounding the book is in order, since, as you'll see, the book has provoked an unprecedented reaction. In June 2009, just as Rick submitted his manuscript of this book to Duke University Press, the Dean of Social Sciences at UC San Diego, Jeff Ellman, sent Rick a letter ordering him not to publish his work or to discuss it at any public forum or professional meeting. The penalty, Ellman said, was written censure, reduction in salary, demotion, suspension, or dismissal. The letter declared that Biernacki's research and manuscript, and here I quote from the letter, may damage the reputation of the college, of a colleague, and may therefore be considered harassment. As all of you know, chapter 4 in this book focuses on a work by John Evans, a colleague of Rick's at the UC San Diego Sociology Department. It's one of 3 exemplars discussed in Rick's book. In 2011, following an extensive investigation, the Committee on Academic Freedom at UCSD unanimously condemned the dean's letter as a violation of academic freedom. This was followed by a resolution by the UCSD Faculty Assembly that called on the administration promptly and publicly to acknowledge the violation of academic freedom. This the administration has refused to do. As a consequence, the case Biernacki versus Regents moved to the San Diego Superior Court, where it is still in litigation. The gag order on the publication, however, was lifted, and the book appeared in 2012. Duke no longer wished to publish it, so it was picked up by Palgrave Macmillan series in Cultural Anthropology, edited by Jeff Alexander and others. Today we're going to focus on the content of Biernacki's book, not its reception. But it behooves us to consider, what is it about this book that sets it apart from many other scholarly volumes that are driven by a critique of a particular method or theory? And the answer, I think, is, ironically, Biernacki's own methodology. What distinguishes this work is his approach, described by the author as follows. Place the artifact case on the table, i.e. the text. Reenact its construction. Disassemble it. Ask how it might be put together differently. Pesteringly intervene to see if the model represents worldly phenomena at all. Those are my actions, and they demand scrupulous detail. In 3 major case studies in the book, involving, as you know, Nazi recruits, bioethicists, and book reviewers, as well as some secondary examples involving his own research, previous research, Biernacki follows this procedure. He deconstructs and then reconstructs each step in the formulation and the implementation of the research design. His analysis raises very serious questions about scholarly procedure. On the one hand, in mounting these critiques, Biernacki conforms to a long-standing tradition in academia, reminiscent of E.P. Thompson's deep questioning of Neil Smelser and Dietrich Reutermeyer's critique of Reinhard Bender. Far less respectful, incidentally, than the tone in Biernacki's book. But Biernacki goes one step further than any of his predecessors. He alone has undertaken to perform what might be called intensive case study from within. Intensive case study from within. In applying this procedure, he has, to my knowledge, done something truly unique. And his discoveries are not edifying. This book is not just about a flawed method applied by some cultural sociologists to analyze primary texts. It is not just about an unresolved tension between humanistic and scientific logics. It is also about scholarly malpractice. And on that cheerful note, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. And I'd like Dylan to begin, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. Sure. Thanks for setting the context of the discussion for us, Vicki. What I would like to do, I guess just very briefly, is to sort of lay out what I see as 2 major types of critique that Biernacki is trying to make in the book, and then interrogate a little bit the relationship between these 2 critiques. And then I'll just conclude very briefly. So, as Vicki was saying, the book is made up of 3 intensive case studies. The first focuses on Berman and Stovell's article, Becoming a Nazi, which appeared in Poetics in 2000, and then the second, John Evans' book, Playing God, which came out with Chicago in 2002, and the third is Wendy Griswold's article, The Fabrication of Meaning, Literary Interpretation in the United States, Great Britain, and the West Indies, which was published in the AJS in 1987, which kind of is a seminal work, obviously, in the kind of formal sociology of culture. So let me just lay out briefly what the critiques are of these 3 texts. Berman and Stovell's article, which was a network analysis of a story, as you will know, claimed to show that National Socialists became National Socialists by progressively abandoning non-party forms of identity, right? So the authors constructed a network model. The evidence for the claim, as Biernacki shows is a single story from a 1934 collection of stories that was written by party members. And the authors constructed a network model of the story in which they showed, or they claimed to show, that a new Nazi self emerges from an illusion of social relations, right? Now, the underlying idea here about the idea that, you know, Nazis were made Nazis through a stripping of social ties goes all the way, you know, at least back to Arendt, right? And this idea that the way in which party members became party members was through a kind of a process of social atomization. And Biernacki shows, I think if I wanted to summarize the main point of Biernacki's critique of this piece of research, it is that the research empirically was not based on the consultation of the actual biography, of the actual autobiographies, but was based instead on a condensation, a sort of a summary of one of the autobiographies published as an appendix to a book, 1938. Biernacki goes back to the original biography, and he shows that Abel's appendix excised precisely evidence of the rich social ties that Stovall and Berman then found to be absent when they coded the story, right? So in Biernacki's words, Berman and Stovall reported facts about what was missing in Haradi's account, but the stuff that was missing in the account had been excised through the extract that had been made of the story, right? So the nature of the critique is just that the very thing that they claimed to be central, you know, this absence of social ties, was what had been edited out. And so that there was a fundamental just problem in the design of the research method. The second example that Biernacki takes up is John Evans' Playing God. And the thesis of that book is that there has been a trend toward kind of increasing instrumental rationality in Weberian terms in the debate about the ethics of human genetic engineering. And what Biernacki shows in the book is that this finding is an artifact of Evans' selection procedure, the way in which he selected texts. So that in the period between 1959 and 1973, Evans' selection criteria were relatively broad, and in part they were relatively broad because there was no official bioethical debate on human genetic engineering. But that then Evans restricted his sample sharply from 73 to 95, and Biernacki says that, you know, Evans excluded cloning as a keyword in this second sample. And Biernacki then reproduces Evans' own research by using the same terms that Evans did in Playing God, but specifying them as keywords rather than primary topics. And the significance of that is that he finds lots of evidence for substantively rational debate about human genetic engineering that was excluded by what seems to be a kind of fairly arbitrary set of decisions about how basically to define the sample from which these texts are being drawn. So that's the sort of second case study. The third case study focuses on Wendy Griswold's fabrication of meaning. The central argument of that text is that the ambiguity of cultural products is what in part produces their cultural power, so if they are ambivalent in some way. To substantiate that point, Griswold coded a series of reviews of George Lamming's novels, and she found that the reviews that mentioned ambiguity were more likely to be positive than those that did not. But Biernacki indicates that Griswold, in doing that, elides two different meanings of the term ambiguity, as a topic in the novels and as a reaction of the reviewer. If you remember, Griswold's claim was about the reaction of the reviewer, not the topic of the novel. And so what Biernacki shows is that many of the positive reviews that explicitly mention ambiguity treat it as a topic, and therefore they don't see the novel as ambiguous at all. Ambiguity is the theme, the explicit, non-ambiguous theme of the novel, right? So that Griswold's criterion for coding the review, the explicit mention of ambiguity, is itself ambiguous, right? You can't decide unless you put it in the context of that. Now I want to focus on a sort of the general, if we draw the general thrust of these critiques, these are, I mean, they're extremely trenchant critiques, and they do depend on, as Vicky was saying, kind of redoing the research, essentially. But they focus really on a set of flawed research practices. But the agenda of reinventing evidence and social inquiry is broader than that. And I would like to emphasize that this text is, in my view, does not focus on these as examples of these are personal weaknesses of the authors. Or even, I mean, there is the sense that maybe there's some malpractice here, but in a sense I think Biernacki is going after something broader, because what he wants to say is that the empirical failings, or the failings of the research, are based not on sloppy design, but on some very basic misconception about what it means to research cultural objects. And what's that broader point? I mean, that broader point, I think you can put it this way. What natural scientists do when they code phenomenon of the natural world is to uncover patterns that are hidden from direct perception. When cultural sociologists apply a coding procedure to cultural objects, what they are doing is covering over an object that has explicit meaning built into it with an apparatus that makes it obscure. Right? So that the function of coding in the natural and social sciences is the opposite in some sense. In the natural sciences it can reveal, but in the social science it essentially, at least in cultural sociology, it essentially obscures. And I thought that one of the statements in the book sort of gets this point across with really great clarity. He says, to assess the plot of The Three Little Pigs, no child would count the number of times that the wolf blew down a house and the network ties of those mentions versus the number of times that the house remained standing to decide which action was more central. Because the meaning of The Three Little Pigs is in the story that is there to convey the meaning. So the question then arises, if coding undermines rather than illuminates cultural products, why do scholars engage in it? And in that context, Biernacki uses the concept of ritual. And what he tries to say is that, look, what's going on here essentially is a ritual reconstruction, which involves a separation of the everyday object, that is to say the cultural product, its disintegration into unit facts, and then the rearrangement of these unit facts into ambiguous symbols that then can be interpreted by experts. Finally, these interpretations come with normatively laden conclusions that are really about the academic profession. And so, in some ways, what Biernacki is saying is that the real function of formal cultural sociology is to reaffirm a set of particular professional identities about social scientists more than it is. I mean, this is the sort of thrust of the line of argument here. So that's those are the two different kind of critiques. I want to talk briefly about how we might want to assess that. And I want to suggest that if we think about this clearly, there is, I think, a tension in the relationship between Biernacki's specific critiques and these broader claims about coding. And I think what I would do is put it this way. A lot of Biernacki's strongest arguments do not refer to coding per se, but to the selection of documents to be coded. And so one wonders if, for example, Berman and Sobel had used the original biographies and found evidence of dense social ties throughout the story, thereby challenging, for example, the wisdom of the Neo-Tocquevillian school, would Biernacki have accepted that as a legitimate piece of research? Or if Evans had included the text that Biernacki identifies and concluded that there was in fact little change in the debate over HGE, would that count as good research practice? And I doubt it, I think, for Biernacki. But it's sort of an odd position to be in, because on the one hand, the very power of Biernacki's critiques of the specific research practices in these pieces of research sort of casts some doubt on the kind of broader, what's going on with this broader set of critiques, that this is a basically misconceived research strategy as such. So there's something we should explore there about the broader and the more specific claims. The other thing I would just like to touch on briefly is the status of interpretation in Biernacki's analysis. Biernacki calls really for a return to Weber's notion of ideal types. And he proposes that the ideal types, be used in a way to convey meaning, right? That, and he draws on the example of Weber and Weber's use of Richard Baxter's work, which he says is used by Weber because the work compacts the theological predicaments of Puritans' everyday life. And these kind of cultural exemplars can then be intensively studied in their cultural contexts. Meanings are preserved and explicated in that approach rather than being effaced as with coding. But I would just say, this is a fairly particular position on the process of interpretation itself. And it made me think more than anything else of Collingwood. I mean, in Dilthey also, obviously, but the idea that texts are just available to us because they are created by human beings who impart meaning to them. That's what culture is. And I think there's something very attractive about that view. But it's also, in some ways, you wonder, what would he say about the kind of, post-structuralist and structuralist skepticism of the idea that meanings of cultural products are so available to a kind of a hermeneutic procedure in this way? It seems like that involves some pretty strong claims about the meaningfulness of cultural objects, and we might want to discuss that a bit. Just in closing, you should remember, of course, that Foucault himself described himself as a happy positivist. And there is a similarity, in a sense. There is an elective affinity, I would say, between the post-structuralist turn and formal cultural sociology, in precisely that sense. And Biernacki, in a sense, represents a more classical position in the field. And that is an issue that I think would be worth exploring.
Thanks. Let's go counterclockwise. So Heather, would you mind?
I actually would prefer to go third if you don't.
Oh, I don't mind. Do you mind? Maura?
So thanks, and thanks to the graduate students for organizing this. I think it's a really great opportunity to talk about a really important book. So I think this book is long overdue. I think it puts a conversation on the table that our discipline needs to have. And I think that one of the reasons that this book is both important and controversial is that it runs counter to the prevailing live and let live culture in American sociology. By which I mean this situation where every subfield is basically left to do its own thing, with less and less concern within subfields about the legibility, much less the accountability to the discipline and the broader social scientific enterprise as a whole. So I think this book provides an opportunity, as well as some leverage, to counteract the fragmentation of our discipline. And therefore, to just dismiss it or ignore it and proceed as usual would be a mistake. It would be a missed opportunity. So in my view, this book has two primary aims. First, obviously, it's a project of diagnosis and deconstruction. It's an effort to systematically challenge and undermine the scientific credibility of the currently dominant approach to sociological research on culture. So far, I think it's this book's critical project that has brought it so much attention. It's worth reading Biernacki's critiques of these studies very closely. I think a close reading of his criticisms is important in order to sort out, as Dylan was suggesting, which of the problems he uncovers are instances of sloppy research practices on the part of a few practitioners, and which are truly damning of the entire enterprise of coding as a method to discover meaning in texts. I think that much of our discussion today will focus on the nature and merits of these criticisms. But this book also has a second aim, which is a constructive project. It's an effort to remind us that we do have, or should have, a set of basic common standards of rigorous research that transcends the increasingly fragmented subfields of our discipline. As I read it, this book aims to resuscitate a set of completely basic and foundational scholarly practices as the minimum common denominator for good sociological research on culture, or anything else for that matter. I think that the constructive project of this book risks being overshadowed in its reception by both the tone and the substance of the critical project and the controversies that these have generated. So I decided to use my few minutes today to flag what I see as the book's most important constructive interventions, or prescriptions for future research in the field, in order to put these on the table for discussion along with the issues related to the book's critical project. So while the book's critical aims are decidedly, and at times it may seem deliberately controversial, I think actually that for the most part the prescriptive claims are decisively modest, and frankly I find them hard to disagree with. So for now I'm just going to flag 3 of Biernacki's prescriptions for sound sociological research that aims to determine the meaning of texts. First of all, this book prescribes reading. Indeed, one way to read this book is as an ode to the craft of close, careful, historically informed reading. Personally, I find it hard to disagree with the idea that the best way to discern meaning in a text is to read it. The book reminds us, of course, that reading is a complicated cognitive task, that it's far from a mechanical operation. We glean meaning from what we read by attending to the relationships of words to other words, the relationship between words chosen and others that could have been chosen but were not, the relationship between different parts of the text and the whole. We also discern the meaning of text in relationship to the broader context of its production, which includes its relationship to other authors and their texts, the original purposes for which it was produced, as well as its position within the broader social context. As a consequence of all of this, our findings or our claims about the meaning or significance of a text is always subject to revision, pending discovery of new evidence about relevant features of the social context of its production or of the field of cultural products of which it formed a part. Okay, so prescription number 1 for researchers who aim to understand and explain the meaning of textual data is to read it. Second, and as a close counterpart to the first prescription, this book advocates the use of footnotes. Now I think Biernacki's advocating more footnotes not just as a historicist's obsession, although there may be some of that too. He's advocating footnotes as both a metaphor and a method for realizing fundamental principles and values of scientific research in this field. The traceability of claims to their source, the transparency of data, how we turn data into evidence, and how we interpret what we read. The ability to revisit sources upon which our claims are based, to weigh those claims against alternative interpretations or in light of new evidence. So as Biernacki writes on page 8, advancement in this field will happen through iterative processes of what he calls wary reasoning, by which he means provisional conclusions that are plausibly true and can be assessed and reassessed through return to the empirical basis for them. So in contrast to close reading and the use of footnotes, Biernacki suggests that the reliance on coding to capture meaning tends to cut the tether to the underlying original empirical referent. Now maybe not technically, because of course software allows that original referent to be retained, but in terms of the relevance of that referent to the claims made by the analysts about meaning. So basically Biernacki is just arguing that if you want to make claims about the meaning of the text, the best practice available to us is to read the text in a holistic and contextualized way, and to cite the original sources upon which your claims are based in your published work. To my mind, this is hardly controversial medicine. Third, and here he gets slightly more controversial, this book advocates for divorce. Specifically, it calls for the separation of interpretive and quantitative approaches to analysis of cultural meaning. He writes many times that it's the blurring of these two approaches that is the root of all the problems that he catalogs in each of the projects that he tried to replicate. Now, to be clear, the divorce he envisions is not just an amicable separation, where each can go their own way and attend to their own part of the garden of cultural sociology. No, he's calling for a restraining order against quantitative approaches to social scientific analysis of the meaning of texts. At least that's my reading. He's saying that they have no business being in this particular garden at all. Now, admittedly, Biernacki's call for expulsion and exile of quantitative methods from this subfield can sometimes come across as rather harsh. But I think that when you step back and consider his argument from a position outside this contested terrain, his constructive prescription is actually rather less controversial. He's basically just reminding us of the fundamental and completely obvious point that our research methods need to fit our research questions. When our questions are fundamentally about the meaning of texts, quantitative approaches tend to obscure more than they can help to illuminate. While they may appear more scientific, in fact, the basic procedures used by humanists to discern the meaning of texts do a better job approximating the minimum standards of social science as science. So it's not just that qualitative researchers should restrict themselves to some sorts of questions about meaning, and quantitative researchers can restrict themselves to others. As he writes on page 4, my brief is not the cliché that humanist interpretation aims at insight different in kind. More subversively, I insist that such interpretation better fulfills the consecrated standards to which social scientists ostensibly subscribe. He suggests that humanistic approaches to interpretation of text better satisfies the criteria of hard science to which quantitative analysts of culture claim to aspire. These criteria include transparency of process, ability to retest the validity of interpretations, to appraise the scope of generalizations, to recognize anomalous evidence as such, and thus to remain open to falsification or at least revision through presentation of new evidence, and so on. So Biernacki's constructive prescriptions for sociological research on culture are thus quite simple. Read your sources, cite the sources on which your claims about meaning is based, and fit your approach to sociological inquiry to the questions you seek to address. The more radical notion here is that the act of mere reading, closely and holistically and in social context, is the most scientific of approaches at our disposal to engage in sociological analysis of the meanings of texts. I think that this is a critical and original claim, with potential to build a much-needed, or rebuild a much-needed common foundation for our fragmented discipline. It's worth putting this claim, this project, this constructive effort on the table for our discussion today, along with our debates about his critical agenda.
And now for something completely different. This book makes a valuable point. We try to distill meaning from textual data. The verbal output of state bureaucracies, cultural artifacts like novels, essays, poems, tweets, blog entries, and internet postings, news media like newspapers, magazines, radio programs, movies, and television shows, among other things. We have to be careful and clear about our methods, right? This makes a lot of sense to me as someone who repeatedly teaches undergraduate methods, because what makes social science scientific is its use of public methods. We know what one did when one did one's analysis, that have been validated and proven reliable. So far, so good. I totally agree that sociologists who code text, either qualitatively or quantitatively, and trust me, qualitative readings lead to codes. They should explain their methods clearly and completely. And I agree that we seek to generalize the text under analysis to the population for which those texts are drawn, so our sampling plans are really critical, and understanding what the populations are really critical. But in the book, Biernacki goes far beyond those uncontroversial things. Specifically, he conflates any attempt to quantify meanings in a corpus of text with science, and any attempt to interpret meanings in that corpus with humanism. He damns the former unconditionally and lauds the latter. For example, on page 8 he says that talk of validity and reliability within text coding is akin to what a magician does when she shows us that there's nothing up her sleeve. It's mere misdirection. I note also that Biernacki usually puts science and scientific in quotation marks, which denotes his skepticism of the scientific project, while humanism is not in quotation marks, which indicates that he accepts that project. And rather strangely for a sociologist, he also puts the word fact in quotation marks several times throughout this thing, indicating some sort of affinity with postmodernist literary scholars' beliefs that no objective facts can be ascertained about cultural objects, that all is subjective, intrinsic to the interaction between reader and text. If not writer and text, because apparently there is not. I think there was a Shakespeare, but we're still not sure. Okay. Also, the book tries to make these points in some of the most pompous and obfuscatory sociologies I have read in a long time. I contrast it with Michael Lewis's clear, engaging prose in his book Flash Boys. Yes, he's a journalist, not a sociologist, but y'all could learn from him. There he explains the complex inner workings of stock markets in the U.S., specifically the arcane work done by computer programmers, their software programs, and the hardware that carry the information necessary for those markets to work. And the high-speed traders that have thrown grit into this machinery and profited immensely from it. I finished reading Lewis's book just before I sat down yesterday to review my notes from Biernacki's book and write up this commentary. And as those of you who've taken classes with me and had me read your work know, I hate bad writing. It not only hinders the accumulation of knowledge, it can actually cause the accumulation of error or nonsense masquerading as knowledge instead. So, and then pomposity is just like fucking irritating. No 50-cent words when you can use a 5-cent word. Sorry. No arcane references when you can use a reference in what people would be familiar with. Finally, Biernacki is just downright nasty. He treats the 3 studies he attempts to replicate as if they had no merit whatsoever. And he doesn't give the authors a chance to rebut his claims, right? So this is like my criticism without your response. It's an author that's critics with it, well, he's the critic and doesn't have the authors meet him back. Now, having aired those complaints, let me make deeper inquiry into his characterization of how sociologists code texts. I think he's conflating the coding of text into a set of terms that can be analyzed quantitatively with some kind of pure, ideal, typical, hypothetico-deductive process that starts from the definition of a population to be inquired about and selection of a sample using some sort of statistical procedure. Requires definition of variables in theory in advance of any analysis being done. Requires analysis to be free from intrusion by theory or redefinition by results. Assumes independence of cases and presumes universality of causes. This is sort of what he says early on. This is a caricature. Of course, this is not the way research proceeds. No sociologist really believes his or her theory is universally applicable. That's what social psychologists actually believe, not ours, mine, but the people who do judgment decision making. Instead, we often don't know how general our theories are. We don't really know precisely what the phenomenon we're studying is a case of. We have people see it differently in our own work. What the boundaries of its case are. We always iterate between theory and data. Yes, even laboratory experimentalists do this. Just ask them about manipulation checks if you want to know that. We always use intermediate analysis to inform and refine theory, which then affects our subsequent analysis. No one goes straight from theory to data to analysis without ever revisiting theory. And we do know that texts are not independent of each other. Dynamically, the production of texts at one point in time affects the production of texts at a later point in time. Synchronically, texts produced by actors who are in contact with each other are affected by each other. It's Galton's problem in anthropology. It is true that most research is written as if we had all the relevant theory figured out in advance. We gathered the best data we could to test that theory. We analyzed those data in a single step and presto, there's results. Yeah, that's a writing convention. But that's a convention imposed on us partly by journal editors, and I'm not just complaining about ASR right now, and reviewers who confuse hypothetico-deductive with scientific, right? Biernacki makes 2 arguments that would make all sociological analysis of text, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, impossible to support. 1, no text can be understood as a whole. No piece can be extracted away and analyzed away from the meaning of the complete text. And 2, no text can be understood outside the context in which it was created, its time, and its place. It's a very historicist approach. The first claim would mean that we could never understand the meaning of a word or phrase without understanding every other word and phrase in the text where it occurred. We'd have to know everything. The second would just, I'm taking these to extremes just to push this, right? The second would mean that no one who did not live in the time and place that the text was produced could ever really understand it, right? Together, these arguments would make it impossible to teach social theory. You'd have to read, for instance, all of the Protestant ethic in order to understand anything Weber claims therein, rather than being able to take a piece of it and look at it. According to the second, you couldn't actually understand Weber anyway, because you don't know what he knew, because he knew the most of anybody in the world apparently at that time, and how he lived and how he came to know it, you know. But sort of paradoxically, their stand is not possible. And it's also surprising to me that he holds up historians at some points, not all the way through, but sometimes it's the epitome of excellence in method. I have been studying a historical phenomenon for far too long, the emergence and expansion of magazines in America from 1741 to 1860, and the reciprocal influence of magazines in American society. And I've read a lot of work by economic, political, cultural, legal, literary, and social historians. I am always amazed at how little they explain, much less justify, their methods. It's like methods are the backstory to historians. It's like airing your dirty laundry to put it in front. They don't explain sampling plans. They don't explain the way they extract meaning from the text that they read. And a lot of it is reading text, because that's the way we actually leave evidence behind in some time. Because of my frustration, I spent a lot of time reading what historians do say about their methods, partly going back to my readings as an undergraduate when I was a history student. And one remarkably candid historian, Richard Evans, who is now the Regis Professor of History at Cambridge, so he's not just a Joe Schmo, this is like Collingwood, explained what historians do is not much different in the end what sociologists do. I'm just going to quote from Evans' book, In Defense of History. Historians do not just listen to the evidence, they engage in a dialogue with it, actively interrogating it and bringing to bear on it theories and ideas formulated and present. In this process of dialogue, we must be conscious of the nature of our hypotheses. Otherwise, if we abandon our self-consciousness and fail to develop the art of self-criticism, to the extent that we imagine we're bringing home none, then our prejudices and preconceptions will slip in unnoticed and skew our reading of the evidence. This is sort of what Biernacki's complaining people who actually count things in cultural objects are doing. But note that Evans himself is using words theories and hypotheses to indicate that history, as he conceives it, is a social scientific project. It's not a humanistic project, it's a social scientific project. This is partly because Evans is a student at the A.H. Carr, and who was a part of the Annales School that sort of crossed the short little distance across the English Channel from France to England, to Cambridge specifically. And you know, C. Wright Mills argued that what historians do is just what social scientists do. It's not just sociology, it's the intersection of biography and history. And so the historian's enterprise is one of the most theoretical of the human disciplines. If they have no theory to guide them in their research, they may provide materials for the writing of history, but they can't themselves write it. That task of writing, keeping the record straight, requires explicit attention to much more than just the facts. You can't just read a text. You have to have some idea of what you're reading it for. I don't think Biernacki would say that's not true. But that doesn't mean that you have to read the whole text and only someone who's in this context can really read it in light of that context. Finally, I don't really understand how interpretations of entire text, the holistic approach that he suggests, can solve the problems of replicability that Biernacki has revealed. And yes, they are serious problems of replicability. How completely can anyone, Biernacki or another scholar, articulate his or her interpretive process, articulate this so as to make it replicable by another scholar? This isn't just related to cultural sociology and analysis of text, it's also related to ethnography and to an analysis of in-depth interviews. So this is across different kinds of data gathering ways. And how can we possibly analyze large quantities of text in these ways rather than in ways that people like Griswold and Evans do?
Thank you. Okay, well look, let's try and change the dynamic here from presenters to conversational style. And what I'd like to ask is for you to, if you have any ideas to contribute, responses to what you've heard or to the book that you've read, I'd like you to raise your hand and make your contribution and have other people respond to you, but don't speak to us, speak to everyone, because now everyone's in the conversation, okay? Who wants to start us? You certainly can start by reacting to what we said, I'm not excluding that, but I'd just like to change the dynamic a bit.
Well, I just wanted to really briefly just share a thought I had as Heather was talking that I was really captured by Biernacki's ritual kind of discussion of the idea of the ritual, and how the ritual, what the ritual sort of is it's the ritual of, in a sense, like expertise, but expertise drawn from above. So the social scientist is saying, you know, I didn't impose any meanings on this data. Here's what the analysis says, and yet in all of the setup, the meanings are imposed on the data. But the point is that Biernacki thinks the ritual is the ritual of saying, this is what sort of science is about. This is what cultural sociology is about. Part of what Heather was saying, I think, is that his kind of exhortation to go back to knowing everything about the historical context, about the text, about the writer, all this thing, creates a kind of a different ritual of expertise where you can be the super well-read historian. No one else has anything they can say about a given text or a given conversation. Yeah, you see what I mean. So this is just a thought I have about there. Is this tension between this critique of expertise and the new type of expertise that's created by this critique.
This is kind of made me think of this again, but I want to really interrogate Marie's claim that it's obvious and uncontroversial to say that reading the text is the best way to understand its meaning or get its meaning. So I think in many ways, in many times, in many questions, it isn't the best way to understand the meaning of the text, reading it. There are many reasons not to be reading it in this holistic way that Biernacki is suggesting reading it. And that doesn't get at the meaning of it, because you may be looking for patterns outside of the text, how the text relates to something larger that's going on, or other texts at the time. And this question about, is the meaning immediately available to us as readers, clinical structuralists, this critique. Because when we read, we impute meaning into it as we're reading it, as Griswold said, but we have confirmation bias. So when we're reading it and we want to prove something, we see a quote, and we say, yes, that confirms what I think about that text. We draw out the quote, we put the quote in the footnotes and say, see, it confirms, this is what's doing it. But what we don't understand is what else is going, or we don't know is what else is going on in this text or across text, or maybe even something that we haven't read that is making that meaning different. So I actually don't think close reading is sometimes the best approach. And sometimes there's a distance reading that is kind of a catchphrase now, and Biernacki doesn't like, can draw out patterns that aren't immediately available to the human reader, and that doesn't mean they're not real, or doesn't mean they're not there, but it does require a different type of approach, a different way of getting at the text, to see those patterns or to understand those patterns that reading will do. And you can provide quotes, you can provide footnotes, you can provide the source data. I mean, there's all of the ways to do that in a scientifically sound way, but is still not this kind of holistic reading that Biernacki is prescribing. So I don't think that it's, I don't buy the argument, I guess.
But, yes.
I would like to get your reactions on kind of his theory of meaning, because it seems like when Biernacki invokes Weber, he really does so as this kind of methodological forefather, right? He can get at the ideal types, but it seems like what's implicit in this book is not just the Weberian theory of the ideal type, but really a Weberian theory of meaning, right? That is not really discussed, right? He has to have this like big apparatus of the philosophy of science, really, right, to make this argument that the meaning he's after is a meaning that is concentrated in individual actions, right, or in individual documents. That is very different from what you might get out of Durkheim, for example, right? And it seems like to some extent the whole of his argument hinges on this thing that is very, very implicit in the book, right? Because if you don't buy that, then even if you only care about meaning, or if meaning is the thing you're concerned about, right? If you don't think that is the right way to think about meaning when you go with the cycle, right? But yeah.
Anyone else? Catherine said her hand up.
Well, I was gonna go back and actually comment on something that was just said here, but I feel like what was just said in there is like a really, I don't know, like I feel like it's a really different type of project than some of the things you've seen here. I'm thinking specifically about the Berman and Stovall piece about the becoming a Nazi, where they're taking, I feel like what's really frustrating to me about a lot of the scope, but that example in particular, is that the really egregious methodological errors they make, this like blatant, like they're taking the abridged version instead of the full version of biography, overshadows, which I think are actually other very legitimate critiques, and actually I feel like doing the same with this whole like, but I think that there were other critiques there that are actually about the coding, actually about the method, and he talks about the way that the coding that they did only was looking for instances of cutting ties and not of reformulation of those ties, and how actually a lot of the process they're describing when you go and read the full book is much more about like, it looks like becoming an adult. That yes, you leave your family, you leave your community, but you're making all these new ties, and you're also not, but the coding isn't looking for that, and therefore it doesn't actually show up there. And so I think that is one of these things where if you actually were to read that text, you would interpret it totally differently than if you're just to apply this coding scheme. But I think that's about like looking for meaning within a particular text, which is a really different thing than if you're looking at other, I don't know, the distance reading, if you're looking at a huge corpus of things and trying to find patterns. And I haven't really thought that much about that kind of work, and I know that you know a lot more about that. But I feel like that those are different enterprises, and that I think that like what Berman and Stovall are trying to do in that is just, I think it's a fundamentally a mistake to try to use a network analysis to make sense of a narrative that is produced in this particular way.
And I think that when Catherine gives this idea of finding patterns, I mean, I think we need to specify what do we mean by patterns. I mean, partly what he does, I think, in this book is not only challenge method, but really what the object of cultural sociology should be. And so toward the end, there's this one line that I think sums it up on 136, where he says, it's the path to finding the semiotic devices by which a culture takes shape, the real objects of investigation, beyond the overt population averages. And so again and again, he raises this concept of the real object of sociology in the conclusion. It sort of shifts the argument, I think. I mean, I think he begins with a methodological critique and ends with almost, I don't know if you want to call it an epistemological critique or really what the enterprise of sociology is about, and trying to identify what is it that cultural sociology is trying to analyze here. And so in so doing, I think he's able to point out methodological sloppiness along the way, kind of conflate this with an epistemological critique, that they're two sort of, I think, very different enterprises in the book.
Anyone else? Want to?
Can I respond to Catherine's thing about why you shouldn't use a network analytic method to actually analyze a narrative? David Heiss and Andy Abbott have both produced, it's like they both created ways to analyze narratives using things that resemble network analysis, that stuff connects to stuff before and after over time. Andy calls his event sequence analysis, and David Heiss calls his event structure analysis. I don't know why. And it seems to me that, for instance, to analyze someone's career, the kind of work that I have seen people do a lot, including Kate Stovall in her dissertation work, it makes a lot of sense to think about how to diagram things that happen over time to someone, right? It's just a question of the source is a different thing, and then whether you're focusing on breaking ties or breaking and creating ties, you can still do that within network analysis. This is not, or a network-like analytic structure. It's the question of, are you focusing on the wrong thing, first of all, the wrong sample, and are you focusing on the wrong thing, only one outcome rather than another outcome, which could create social connection rather than social disintegration. I mean, you could use their method differently and come up with different stuff.
I think that one thing that was absent from this talk was the idea that we need to be less committed to the consequences of our methods and think about them more heuristically. And so when you say it's a diagram, and we can use this like event history analysis as
It's event structure.
event structure
Yeah,
analysis.
event sequence analysis. Event history is different.
we can use these methods to get at a phenomenon, but we use them heuristically, and so I think part of the critique that Biernacki is making is that we tend to make ontological commitments based on these methods in ways that aren't honest, or in ways that aren't open to critique, and I think it has to do with how he envisions social scientific practice being played out. So there's issues at the methodological level between how we assess evidence, and then there are social issues about how we evaluate each other and how we determine what counts as good sociology or bad sociology. And these are like two sides of the same process, and I don't think he treats these two levels of critique separately, and he sort of like mixes between them sometimes in constructive ways and sometimes in non-constructive ways. And I think that the work itself, the book itself, is kind of like interesting because of how it was received, precisely because of its criticism.
Who wants to? Is there anyone who hasn't spoken who wants to jump in?
Well, I would like to like push or sort of throw some light on a potential point of disagreement amongst the panel. I mean, on the one hand,
Oh, there might be.
but on the one hand, there seems to be, I mean, a very
Speak as one voice.
there seems to be a very sort of firm agreement on the idea that Biernacki has on the one hand has this project about revealing malpractice, and I think everybody sort of agrees that that this is sort of a devastating critique done very well. Well, with the idea that he could have been fairer, right? But I think that in the sense of him revealing malpractice, okay.
That attributes intentionality,
Errors.
things that we
Okay.
can't see. Sorry.
Maybe we
Okay.
can call them errors.
Okay. But that in any case, the idea isn't for Biernacki or for us as readers that for that to be the central issue, right? The idea is like independently of this particular authors that he discusses, the idea is there's sort of principal issues that underlie coding that are problematic. And I think the panelists sort of agreed that, what I'm trying to do is reproduce, I think he's arguing. You agreed that it was, that the issues he points to are real issues, are serious issues, but that they're in fact present in all other methods. And so that his critique at the end becomes much less polemic, right? You might agree with it, but you have to apply this critique to a bunch of other methods. But there was a point also, I think, made by Dylan that he conceives of the object of cultural sociology as very different from other objects. And concretely, the idea that these are objects that are imbued with meaning as a definitional feature. Like text, for example, the whole point of text is to convey meaning, and so therefore you're dealing with something that already has meaning, and then the second act is to reconvey meaning on it. And I don't know if the implication there is somehow this is really different from other objects and so on. So, and in any case, that's the one of the disagreements that I would like to hear the panelists talk a little bit more about.
Yes, Jim.
Can I just sort of throw one other question in the pile, or do you want to respond to that? This is on a slightly different topic, but I just want to put it on the agenda. Okay, cool.
Sure.
I want to draw attention to what I see as a potential source of agreement among the panelists.
Enlighten us, please.
So a lot of these questions seem to revolve around how do we make our sources and research practices available to others, particularly when we have a large number of potential source texts, right? And there are two extremities to this. One is you throw your sampling net as wide as possible, and that has issues of accessibility that come along with it, because it's harder to make a very large number of texts, especially when some of them are hard to find accessible to people. Another is to choose a small set of texts that can be examined very closely within whatever research document you're trying to produce. And one approach involves a set of conventions that Biernacki identifies as this ritual circle, where you have your methods and sampling in front, and you use that to kind of separate it from the sources themselves. And another puts that stuff at the end, right? And you have your footnotes, and that's where you explain the linkage between your texts, your sources, and your claims. This doesn't seem like it's that different to me, and I say this as somebody who's done a little bit of quantitative research. When I do quantitative research and there's a core text, I go to that person's website, I find their stata file and their data file if they're economist, and they make that available to it, and you sort of rummage around in it, and you try to understand how they came to the conclusions that they came to. When I'm doing a historical project and I have a core text, I go to where they list the files that they looked at in the archive. I look at those files, I reread them, I look at other ones nearby that they may or may not have read, it just doesn't seem that different to me. And if that's the case, then is the issue really about these sort of conventions that Heather identifies that make it harder for people to track down their sources? Rick at Biernacki did, I think, a good job of tracking down the sources that people used in this and using them to reinterrogate their arguments. That's kind of the essence of good science to me. It took him a lot of work, it seems, to actually go out and do that, and is that the problem, and the fact that there's a disincentive to do that work in the way that sociologists write, and is that potentially a source of contention, but one that's slightly different from the kind of epistemological issues, I guess.
You know, that's a really good point. If data sources were made available, and for a while, the ASA journals required this, it was in the late 80s, early 90s, I recall. They wanted you to put your data up, and what they were expecting was you to put quantitative data sets up, right? But why shouldn't qualitative researchers have to put up all the text that they analyze if you're doing cultural analysis of text, and your codings of that, right? So we can actually replicate the process. Or why should ethnographers have to put up their field notes, once they've been typed in, and their codes, and their theoretical memos, so we can actually evaluate the process. We had a discussion in research design class, and I was like, no, I can't do that. It's like, sure you can. And just black out the names. The CIA can keep things secret by blacking things out. That would make replication easier. It would make meta-analysis possible, like the kind Randy Hodgson did when he reanalyzed a little over 200 ethnographies of work to create Dignity of Working Men. Dignity at Work, sorry, not Michelle's book, his book. That would make it easier to accumulate knowledge and to compare. It would take storage.
I want to develop an idea that I think might be slightly disturbing. What if this trend toward formal cultural sociology was not just about formal cultural sociology, but was about a fundamental transformation of our culture in the contemporary period? For example, Obama, has speechwriters who compose speeches in light of the number of word counts that will be generated. And can you imagine, what if that kind of practice spread to such an extent that, in fact, formal methods in sociology became self-confirming because meaning was essentially being eliminated from our culture? Because we were fragmenting and pulverizing our cultural products, and therefore that our cultural techniques were getting reincorporated in it. Would that be...
This is a really reflexive sociology.
And essentially what I'm saying is that this is, because I see Biernacki's critique as essentially a critique of reification, in the sense that what he's saying is that, from his perspective, look, I think that there have been a number of comments that are somewhat misguided, and the notion of totality in Biernacki's work is methodological, right? It's the idea that cultural products, in principle, it's not that they can be, that you just read it and then you know, or whatever. In principle, right, you can go beyond the text, you can put it in some meaningful framework that can be understood. And that, But no, that's not the case, actually. What it means is that, in principle, it would be possible to go a little bit further, right? To achieve a deeper understanding, right? Either by reading the whole text or putting the text in a context. This is, in principle, an endless task. But it does require, as a kind of methodological starting point, the idea that, in fact, the meaning does exist that is connected to a cultural whole, right? Now, what reification, of course, is disintegration of that. Right, it's the fragmentation of the totality, right? And the question that arises with formal cultural sociology and with sort of quantitative indicators of culture in general is if this hasn't become a reflexive process in which, in fact, cultural sociology is complicit in the fragmentation of culture itself. And in the evacuation of meaning, and then reconfirms, and then we're left with this thing, well, these are meaningless, these texts are meaningless. Of course, you could say they could be meaningless, especially if they were produced to be meaningless. If you were producing text to generate word counts. I don't know, I mean, that's just a kind of speculative idea, but it's something that might be worth thinking about.
Why are you equating fragmentation with reification? Dividing text with reification.
Well, I mean, this is the idea. Reification is, I mean, if you think about it in Lukácsian terms, I mean, reification is fragmentation.
I don't usually think of
Yeah.
this.
There is an element of that in Biernacki too. Of course, he's not a Lukácsian by any sense, but there is this idea of that we can understand things in their context, in the context of the text, and in a broader social context.
So I wouldn't go as far as you're going, I think, on this idea of how we are, that social scientists would ever have the capacity to obliterate meaning, but I think the several steps back from that along the same direction is just the very basic idea that when we study classifications, we get more information about the people who are imposing the classifications, designing, right? So I study censuses, of course, this is a totally trivial, non-controversial point when you talk about colonial censuses. Oh, when you go and look at the colonial census categories, what you're getting access to is something about the interests and the cultural cognitive schemes of the census takers. But when you take that very same uncontroversial point and apply it to the practice of social scientists and their coding schemes, right, which is to some extent what he's, I think, getting at when he says that, you know, you have this problem, it's a serious problem of pattern discovery versus pattern creation. And how do you know? How do we know? And I think it's a worthwhile question to be asking. How much of this is pattern creation versus pattern discovery? I think, you know, your provocation or response is interesting and it's worth thinking about, but I guess, you know, I don't immediately, when you say, you know, there's questions about meaning that in text that, you know, there'd be better ways to give that meaning than reading it, nothing immediately comes to mind. And so it all comes back to me for, well, what is your question? And is your question really about the meaning of the text, or is your question about something else? And so I also don't think, actually, that what distinguishes this field is the object. It's the question. The domain is questions about meaning. And if you're trying to do sociological inquiry where your outcome or your, you know, what it is you're trying to explain and understand is meaning, that's the domain, right? So it's not necessarily products that were produced with the deliberate intention of conveying meaning, right? The census, the people who designed the census were not interested in conveying, you know, they're not involved in a cultural product explicitly. That's not the point for them. That doesn't mean we can't find meaning there when we go looking for it, right? And what meaning we find will be affected by the categories we bring to it, our theoretical questions, but it's also, you know, you have this empirical referent and other people can also get access to that and say, well, it's ridiculous to say that that's what it's about because I found this document that tells us this. And this is why they added that question because, right, they needed to count the slaves to do this. And you know, so it's falsifiable in that sense. Any particular claim about the meaning of a cultural object is subject to revision.
Roy, you have a question or comment?
Maybe along the very same line, but just in different words. I would say that Dylan's comment, I'm hiding behind the camera, it's pretty convenient. I would say the only person whose picture is not going to be taken. I would say that Dylan's comment reflects a key limitation in this book, which is that Biernacki still thinks of science as an effort to represent, rather than as a constructive, pragmatic effort to create something new. In a way, is making almost a positivist argument, we have texts, this is our object of analysis, and I know to do it better than the quantitative analyst that's basically bring us to the 19th century and Russian formalism, right? But what happens if we think of scientific project as, even a project of quantification, as a project of taking something and giving it meaning? I mean, I would say that Dylan's argument would be correct if we looked at Peter Biermann's work and we would say this has absolutely no meaning. And I think that you know, through these numbers that indeed create a huge segmentation of various portions and parts of the text and reassemble them in another way, a meaning is created. And this meaning is new. And I don't think we should evaluate it according to whether it matches or doesn't match the original biographies of Nazis necessarily. I think that many people read Biermann and find a lot of meaning in it. Happy, for example. I mean,
But Roy, I mean, evidence and the analysis that you find in a scholarly work, one assumes that there is some connection between these things. I mean, you can look at any body of evidence and have fantasies, but scholarship means that you establish some clear and verifiable connections between your ideas and what there is in the sources that you are drawing upon. You're saying that these are detachable, they're separable, and that's even a virtue, you know? That someone can look at a source and have fantasies that aren't supported by that source. But this is not scholarship, this is maybe writing fiction.
But people can
This is
interpret
writing
text
novels.
differently. You can have different interpretations, both of which are depending on the assumptions that people bring to bear on the text. So I'm having trouble seeing how
Equally
this is the
valid.
same. Well, no, we're not going there.
We are, because that is precisely what this is an
I know, but
empiricist project. He's a historian, and he's saying there is an empirical record. And some claims about the meaning of a text are more valid than
Correct,
actual.
they're not equally valid, I agree,
Absolutely.
I'm just saying.
And how do we arbitrate? And
If you can say,
I
there could
think
be reasons for, there are reasons that people would have different approaches to these things, I would give you that. But I certainly would say they're equally valid. But there's not one truth to be drawn from the single.
there can be more than one meaning.
and the text is creating this meaning, yes.
Many interpretations, but it is our task as those who evaluate other people's scholarship to establish for ourselves, to our satisfaction, are those conclusions properly connected to the evidence which they present to support those conclusions. And that's our task as readers, as critical readers, to decide that, and as writers,
Sense of science.
to make that happen, to make that connection really clear.
Could I say, this discussion, actually, your point, Roy, it emphasizes the thing I said at the last part of the talk, which is the connection between sociological positivism and postmodern time. Because they're both basically positivistic. So I actually disagree in this sense with Heather, who was trying to put Biernacki in the camp of the post-structuralist. I think he's a very classical kind of modernist in a sense. I mean, he very much believes in the idea that there is a meaning there to be determined, and and it is, as Mara was saying as well, this is a defense of the kind of science. There's a kind of scientific realism about it, and so on. So that's what his position is, I
So why
think.
is science always in
I
quotation
think
marks?
science as ritual is in quotation marks, and science as science is not in quotation marks.
Exactly. And this is a perfect example of how counting can mislead you. If you go through the book and you look at those places where science is in quotation marks, you'll see that he's using it with an ironic trope, deliberately to say to the reader, I am suggesting that this is not real science. This is a pretense to science, okay? But other places he does not put it in quotation marks, and there he's using it in the usual sense that we understand commonly science. There is a perfect illustration of how counting words in text can be very misleading. You say, how many times does he mention science? Well, But if you don't distinguish between the ironic and non-ironic, you've got a total misinterpretation of his
Irony
meaning.
only applies to anything quantitatively key, then it's a total condemnation of everything quantitative, which is a huge problem. You can't say that counting things is always bad.
I think you've misread the book, Heather, if you think
I
that
know,
he is
no,
saying
Vicky, I have
everything quantitative is flawed.
In
This is
analysis
not
of
his
cultural
point.
objects.
He is
you
referring
must-
only to primary text subjected to cultural analysis.
Correct,
He is operating within that sphere, okay?
and that's
It's
always bad to
important to
count
limit
something.
it.
It's always bad to count something if that's what you're doing. That's what he's saying.
Yes, I don't know your name, but
My name's David. So I wanted to just point out two aspects of Biernacki's argument that we haven't talked about and that might be being taken for granted by the panelists. And the first is that he's not just talking about texts. On page 143, he says that the same critiques are applicable to complex business organizations or other kinds of social institutions. And then the second point is that even though he name checks Weber a lot, his methodological principles don't come from Weber, they come from Giorgio Agamben, who, in my limited understanding of Agamben, it's been a few years since I read him, he's not a modernist. He came after Foucault and actually absorbs a lot of Foucault's methodological principles when it comes to talking about diagrams versus ideal types and things like that. And so in light of the fact that he's obviously read a lot of Agamben and thought about these issues, I was wondering if the panelists had revisions to make to their assertions that he's
What evidence is there that Agamben, what is the methodological lesson that he draws from Agamben? I'd just be curious to know.
Well, it's just the analogical reasoning, I think. He talks about paradigms as being analogical rather than sort of like we find a definitive meaning in a text and then we find that same meaning in other texts, but merely the comparison of them allows us to see new kinds of analogies that can be drawn. So it's actually a really constructive interpretive process. It's just sort of my like two-line understanding that could be totally challenged by anyone who's read Agamben. And so I just wanted to see if we could extend the argument beyond like when we're talking about texts, like meaningful objects, but that the interpretation of meaning actually goes into the sampling method in a much deeper way. And I wanted to put that dimension of the interpretation argument that he's making on the table, that when we're talking even about organizations, we're interpreting what kind of organization that is, and even if we don't intend to interpret the meaning of that organization or any of its products in our later analyses, that there's a moment of interpretation that goes into our sampling design that needs to be, that is subject to a lot of these same critiques.
I think the scope is still, if your question is about meaning, yes, you can ask a question about the meaning of practices on the trade floor, right? But, so that's the broadening beyond text is questions about meaning in other domains. That's how
yes.
I think there's a way we could talk about this in terms of Weber, maybe more general, like sort of expanding the conversation beyond coding, and then also ask, it is sort of strange that the critique he makes and then turning to the ideal type is sort of this somewhat dissatisfying response to the critique. Because it seems like really what he's talking about is what Weber calls the fact-value problem. And Weber's solution to that problem, well, to the extent that he tries to pursue one, is some sort of what at least we call in American sociology value neutrality, which I think is often given a very boring sheen where in American sociology, where the idea is to somehow try and neutralize your values in order to let the facts emerge, which is not at all what Weber's after. What Weber's after is to be very clear, systematic, scientific, and transparent about what's fact and what's value. And of course it's impossible that, especially a social scientist, could ever engage with any sort of social science without his or her ethical, political convictions being part of his research, his or her research. And so it's really a call from, to the extent that Weber himself takes it up is debatable, but what his program is to be transparent, to make ourselves as researchers and our own ethical and political convictions and involvements in our research as transparent and sort of part of the science as possible. Oftentimes that, oftentimes, to the extent that we found a good way of doing this is debatable. You get sort of French peasants who become the heroes of overturning or overcoming symbolic domination. The process of making ourselves part of the research often becomes this heroic fantasy of so the way we haven't really found a good way of doing that without it sort of fueling the fantasy, but I think that's actually the invitation, and that I don't see the ideal type as really the responding to that invitation.
I'm trying to recognize people who haven't spoken yet, and this gentleman here, did you want to say something?
Sure, I wanted to comment about the point with the sampling. This is kind of a deeper version of this argument, because I work in a case study format. It's an historical case study, and the things when I read it, I kind of felt like a valorization of this type of methodology, especially the issue coming up a couple times about sameness, and therefore the definition of populations, and therefore the kind of ways sampling relates to epistemological questions. And, because I've studied a very particular historical period for a long time, and I don't compare it to other things. I'm always protective in that sense of when people are using it in context of larger models or comparisons or whatever. So I'll always be, able to think of it find a way of, that's kind of a simplification of my case here or whatever. But I think the revalorization I felt was that the theory is emergent from the study of the case or the text, and the ultimate reference is back to this case, and that's what has the authority ultimately, because he sometimes is somewhat critical of even theory as macro-consequence sociology also. So I felt that's kind of where there's this linkage between, in the one sense, this is how cultural sociology interprets the text, which is a bit aside from my field, but in the grander sense that we're offering interpretations, whether the stronger vehicle in this interpretation is our theories / our methods, or whether it resides in this empirical framework we're drawing all this out of itself, it being the single text or the single historical case study or whatever, prior to these other procedures we've been including population sampling, comparison, defining categories or fronts.
We're getting near the end of our time, and I'm going to recognize Daniel for the final comment.
And mine will be quick. Don't really have a substantive thing to add other than just point you to, if you want to continue this engagement with this issue, some of you may have been in that crowded room in New York last summer at ASA with the panel with Biernacki, our own Ann Swidler, Michelle Loveman, some other folks. This June's issue of Qualitative Sociology takes up this exact issue as well, and there are original essays by those authors, John Hall, a few others. So it's the June issue of Qualitative Social, if you want to check it out. Also, thanks to everyone for coming. The panel, thank you so much. There's a sign-up sheet going around. We have to turn it in for bureaucratic purposes. Sign up for that, please.
Okay, I think we have one of my iPhone, 1 more minute. So I guess I'd like to ask the panelists if you have just a quick word to add in response to these many interesting interventions.
You're supposed to start.
That's exactly the reverse order.
I enjoyed the conversation. I think there's a lot of questions we've left hanging that I'm happy to continue these conversations as we go forward. I would just say that overall, I think that those of you who didn't read this as a defense of science the first time through, I encourage you to try rereading it, because I think that that's the fundamental message of this book.
Be clear and explicit about your methods. And your connection between theory and methods as they develop over the course.
Ontology matters.
Yeah.